Hello, this is Jurgen Rasmussen speaking. Welcome to the provocative hypnosis vlog. Let's talk about miracles, or at least attempts at hypnotic miracles. Some successful, some partially successful, and some not successful at all. This is, to me, a really, really cool topic. Now, when I use the word miracles, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek because quite a few of us, I'm speaking about professionals in the neurolinguistic programming and hypnosis communities, quite a few of us are consistently helping people to do stuff that the general public would consider miracles. This is stuff that even the so-called or state-appointed experts of the professions of psychology and psychiatry would also consider miracles or likely impossible, or the claims of a charlatan or a con man. The logic being, because they don't know how to do it, then that of course means that it's not humanly possible most of the time. So when I talk about regular miracles that we do, I'm talking about stuff like helping people actually release their allergies, often in just a couple of sessions. This is possible most of the time. Most people have no idea that it's possible. I'm talking about stuff like helping people who have had migraine headaches for decades either dramatically reduce the symptoms or actually let them go. I'm talking about helping people with severe PTSD symptoms who have experienced horrible stuff release their symptoms, often in just a session or a few sessions. So, for example, in my life currently, I've recently worked with a 13-year-old boy who had a severe stuttering problem that really affected his life. And now he's 95% rid of the stuttering after 3 or 4 sessions. He's able to, live a completely different social life. His social fears are gone. Most people would consider that a miracle. Right now, in terms of clients, I'm working with a guy who has had daily panic attacks since 1997. Seen several psychiatrists, been on a bunch of medications, and has had talk therapy, and his last psychologist told him, you're so insightful that, I don't think you could really benefit from much psychotherapy. Now, after 2 sessions, the panic attacks are almost completely gone. It's just these mini tendencies, but we're almost completely done. So these cases all qualify as what most people would consider miracles. And for many of us, even though we fail quite a bit of the time too, this is a rather consistent thing. But this vlog is different. I'm talking about what would be considered miracles even for us. Stuff that's completely out of the box. Stuff that when you mention it, people have a tendency to just roll their eyes. That's the really, really exciting stuff. So I'm going to mention 3 cases. One was a complete failure, one was a partial success, and the third one was a complete success. Now, the first case I'll mention to you was a client from Russia who contacted me after having read Provocative Hypnosis, because I talked there about how I used to have this impossibles practice and how I have this no change, no fee policy. He was gay, and he wondered whether I could help him use hypnosis to go from gay to straight. Now, he had been to a couple of psychologists at least, and they of course had told him that this isn't possible, it's not something that you can do. and that you have to learn to accept it and to live with it and to express it. And this seems to be, the rational solution. And quite a few people, well, not that many, but a few have given me some flack for actually taking on this case, saying that's what you should be doing too. You should be encouraging him to accept that he's gay, have self-acceptance and to express it. And I agree with that. I agree, because personally I have nothing against gay people. I'm all for gay rights and but on the other hand, this guy lives in Russia. And who am I to say no? Meaning, life as a gay person in Russia is probably a hell of a lot tougher than being a gay person in the Western world. And if the person wants to change it, if that's what he wants to do, why not give it a shot? So that's what I did. So he flew in, and we did hypnosis regression work, essentially presupposing that there was some emotional conflict, some imprint, some unconscious decision having been made somewhere that resulted in his gayness, so to speak. And nothing happened. Meaning, memories came up, so some emotional stuff came up. We had a very, very interesting, I think he was here for 2 or 3 days. We did hypnosis regression work. We did some parts work. He was I would say, medium hypnotic subject. And when he went back to Russia and continued to live life, he told me he was as gay as he'd ever been. Now, it would probably be more accurate to call him bisexual to some extent, because he had some attraction to girls, preferred men. What he did say was that he thought that he had a bit more of an attraction for girls after the sessions, but he was still as gay as ever. Now, why? And of course, he got his money back. So why did I do this? Why did I take on this case? Well, I really think that we all should work as far outside of our scope of practice as possible, because that's the only way you'll learn something new. The idea in the public is that this is something that you can't change and shouldn't even attempt to change. And that's exactly why you want to accept and do these types of experiments, because that's how you get to discover something new. A former mentor of mine, the NLP co-founder, John Grinder, he said something interesting. He said that if you really want to test the effectiveness of a pattern or a way of working, identify contexts where you think that the pattern will be the least likely to work, and then congruently apply it there and see whatever the hell happens. I really like that idea, except that it's not really patterns that work. It's not techniques or rituals that change people. People change from the inside. It really is an inside job, that to speak. You as the therapist or agents of change really is providing the context. A context where people can access and mobilize their own resources. Now, the other case I'd like to talk about is perhaps the most interesting thing I've ever seen. Well, I've seen a lot of interesting stuff, but this was really, really something else. I got contacted by a woman who asked if I would work with her father, who had brain cancer. And when she told me about her father, she said that he had virtually no short-term memory whatsoever. He couldn't read a comic, which he used to love to do, without immediately losing the track. It was virtually impossible to have a conversation with him. He was completely dysfunctional. Now, this woman also told me that she had more or less expected him to get, severely ill for a long time. There had been tremendous family conflicts, stuff eating at him. He was very conflict averse and just couldn't deal with it, and his stress levels were really, really high. Now, is there a relationship between that and the brain cancer? Maybe. We can't really know. But so I, of course, said yes, because this seemed like a completely impossible case. I mean, how do you work with a guy for brain cancer who doesn't have any short-term memory, who can't carry on a regular conversation? How on earth do you do that? So as a result of that, I got really, really excited. Of course, that's the case you want to accept and want to work with. Now, there was no money involved. I should say that. I consider this so experimental that. So when he came to the door, his wife was actually the one who followed him to the door, and I realized I'd made my first mistake, because the daughter, who was really enthusiastic, was the one who had ordered the session, not the wife. I was not aligned with the wife. And this can often be a problem when you do this type of work. So it was really clear that this guy had no freaking clue where he was or what he was doing here. And as he approached me, we both extended our hand. This is common courtesy. And I went straight into a handshake induction. Now remember, this guy had no clue who I was. There's no hypnotic pre-talk. There's nothing. Just went straight into a handshake induction and said, look at that hand. And as you focus on that hand, it begins to move towards your face with honest, unconscious movements now. And that happened. And how long till you only see that hand mentally? Of course, implying that he will, in a non-volitional way, close his eyes. And when his eyes closed, I said, that's right. Now, as you go into a state where we can communicate on an unconscious level, you and I would like to communicate with the part of your unconscious responsible for creating and healing cancer. I'd like this to be the yes finger and that to be the no finger. And when that part is ready to communicate, and I waited. And after a little while, I got a really strong ideomotor signal that was completely non-voluntary. And I asked the guy, I congratulated the guy on communicating, and I said, will you confirm that there is a positive intention behind the creation of this cancer? Now notice I didn't ask if there was. I just assumed, will you confirm that there is? And his yes finger lifted again. Totally non-volitional movement. So I acknowledged that, and then I asked, and then I reminded him that the prime directive of the unconscious mind is maintaining his health. It's of course something I'm just making up to him, but the prime directive of the unconscious mind is to maintain his health. So I instructed him to generate a set of alternatives, other ways of achieving that positive intention that were as effective or more effective than the cancer, and also made sure that these sets of alternatives also allowed him to return to health. After a while, his finger lifted again, and I essentially negotiated a deal with him. And I asked him, do you know how to cure this? Got a very, very congruent yes signal. Are you willing to cure it now that you have these new alternatives? Yes. Got a very congruent yes signal again. Now, at this point, I had gotten only yes signals, as I wanted to see if I could provoke a no signal. So I asked, will you cure the cancer in 2 days? And I got a very solid no signal. And then I asked, will you cure it in 7 days? And I got a yes signal. So that was essentially the deal that we that we did. And then I shook his hand, and he opened his eyes, and I said, "It's nice to meet you." And his first words were, "Where am I? Who are you?" And of course, he had no memory of what had just transpired. Now, do we human beings have an unconscious mind? Who's really answering these questions? These are really interesting questions to ask. Anyways, when he went to the medical doctors to do a checkup or a series of tests, I think this was about 10 days later, the doctors were stunned, absolutely stunned. There was a significant reduction of the tumor. I think about 80% of it was gone. This is unheard of. And they had no clue what had been happening because he had gotten no medical treatment whatsoever. And the tumor had been growing and growing and growing and growing before this. Now, his daughter, who was present, talked about him seeing this NLP and hypnosis guy, and they got pissed. Like, they got really, really angry and wouldn't hear about such nonsense. Now, his wife had promised me to call me and tell me about the results, and she did. And she didn't seem that enthusiastic. And I, of course, offered to do a second session, and I kind of felt that I had to to talk her into it. So she came with him once again. I did the handshake induction again, set up the signals. I asked, have you cured the cancer? Nope. Got a solid no signal. Discovered that there was some sort of objection to doing it. I tried to negotiate, but the signals got very muddy, very unclear. And I asked him, would you like to postpone this? Would it be better if we did it some other day? That's the only time I got a congruent yes signal. So I sent him home, and I kind of arranged with his wife that, when he was ready, that he would call me, and I never heard from her again. And his cancer started growing again, and not long thereafter, he died. And I got this information from the daughter. Now, if you're a cynic, you might automatically conclude that this was just some fluke. And you know what? You may be right. You may be right. This might have been just two incidents that kind of happened simultaneously that has no correlation whatsoever. So you could conclude that. You may be right, but there's nothing to learn from it. When people conclude that, they get to maintain their old belief systems. Based upon having done a lot of similar stuff, I lean strongly, although I can't claim to know, that there is some correlation between what we did and what happened. And it's a really interesting topic. I grew up, I had a family member who had a remission from late-stage cancer. He had lung cancer and had been given weeks to live. There was no hope whatsoever. Now, this was a very religious man. I think this was back when I was a child, my early childhood. And this guy was very religious. And he went to the very small church that he was part of, and people prayed for him. And when they prayed, he had this conviction that he was getting healed, that something was happening. He had even said, I can feel it. I'm healing. It's happening. And when he went back to the hospital a while later, cancer was completely gone. This was a complete remission. And this was a guy who had been given weeks to live. And cancer specialists from various parts of the country came to attempt to understand this. And the cancer never returned. I think about 20 years later, his wife, who he was very connected to, died, and then he didn't want to live anymore either. So shortly thereafter, he developed some other type of cancer, and shortly thereafter, he died. There's a lot of cases like this. Uh, there's a doctor in New York by the name of Kelly Turner who has written a book called Radical Remission, who's done a lot of research into spontaneous remissions, what people do. And often there seems to be a correlation between psychological factors and people having profound spiritual experiences or shifts. In the 70s, Ainsley Mears in Australia, a medical doctor and expert in hypnosis and meditation, documented several cases of cancer remissions after teaching people very deep meditation. And in the late 70s, Carl and Stephanie Simonton documented several cases using various forms of imagery and visualization. I've personally met quite a few people who have had remissions. So I don't think anyone really understands the mechanisms, but at least for some people, some of the time, it's a possibility. It's something well worth exploring. But exploring it, what these people will often tell also is that when they tell their medical doctors, the medical doctors get uncomfortable and often don't want to hear about it. And it's so deep, it's so taboo to even mention this, to even propose this, to even suggest this. And I think largely it's due to the whole mind-body split. We're so, embedded into this notion of mind and body being separate. We've made this up as fiction, and we've forgotten that it's fiction. So we talk about psychological and physiological as if it's completely different things. And since cancer is defined as physiological, then by implication, what we call psychological or emotional or relational or spiritual components of life are then assumed to have nothing to do with whether people develop these types of illnesses or heal from them. Notice also that I'm not making any cause and effect claims here. I'm not saying that a technique or a method cures people, or that's often what cynics hear. And it would be wrong to make those claims, but I think it's also very wrong not to explore this terrain. So the last case I'd like to mention is, this was very early in my career, I think around the year 99, 2000, something like that. I worked with a guy for a pretty minor issue. I can't even remember what it was. And it was defined as NLP. And when he came back, he mentioned that he had epilepsy. And it was quite severe and been going on for quite some time. And I offered to do a free session to see if we could do anything with this using hypnosis. And he agreed. Now, this guy was a profound hypnotic subject, one of those virtuosos. And it was one of the first guys that I worked with who really seemed to have, those hypnotic virtuoso capacities. So, being kind of young and inexperienced and over the top, I even had him hallucinate a strip show, in my old office. And he had a blast. This was completely real to him. And I did a hypnotic regression with him. And stuff came up. He completely cleared it. And then he went home. And I didn't hear from him. I had no idea what had happened. 1 year later, I spontaneously bumped into him at a restaurant. And I asked him about the work we did, and he started talking about NLP and that minor issue and how that had completely disappeared. And I asked him, how about your epilepsy? And he got really confused, and he said, have I told you about that? He went into this really, really bizarre state. And I mentioned the word hypnosis too, and I was like, "Oh, do you do hypnosis?" So it was clear that he had complete amnesia, not only for the session, but even for the fact that we had worked on the issue to begin with. So he told me that, it's really strange, but the epilepsy, this had been something that happened all the time, and it was really debilitating in his life. It actually disappeared. I think along the same time I saw you, it just went away. So that was really interesting. And I had the sense to then not say, well, if you can remember, we actually did this hypnosis session and this happened with the intent of you. I didn't do that. I respected his unconscious need for amnesia. My theory, and this is just a theory, but my theory is that the amnesia might have been unconsciously generated to protect the change. Because to have something like this happen, such a miracle, and then having to face regular Joe on the street or family members who might be physicians or whatever, that's a tough situation. The ridicule, the mocking, and this is also, I suspect, a big reason why Milton Erickson was so big on amnesia when he used to work with clients. This was a nice way to kind of protect the changes, and the person can say, "Well, I don't know what happened. It's just kind of disappeared." Now, of course, if you're a cynic, you could say, "Well, it's bedside manners," as one guy told me not so long ago. Or you could say, "Well, it's just a random fluke." And again, I can't say that it's not. It can be. But based upon having done a lot of strange stuff and seen a lot of miraculous results over the years, I strongly lean in the direction of thinking that there is some correlation. So these are some of my cases and some of my learnings and some of my reflections. I hope it's inspiring. I hope it will inspire more people to not just work with phobias and smoking and anxiety and some light depressions, and to work within a scope of practice and only do evidence-based stuff that the scientific priesthood says that you're supposed to do, but instead to actually test the waters, to actually work a bit outside of the scope of practice. And that might even mean doing a lot of free work. But you know what? It's worth it. It's fun. It's good for the soul, keeps you alive. It really is really, really rewarding. So if you have any miracle cases or attempts at miracles, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear read your comments wherever you might find this, on the blog or on social media. So till next time, aim for those miracles, whether they're hypnotic,